Welcome to another live stream for the History Valley podcast. Today I'm joined by Mark Mattison. Mark M. Madison is an independent writer and scholar. He is the author of several books on extra-canonical gospels and was one of the creators of the divine feminine version of the New Testament. Mark is the administrator of the website gospels.net and a contributor to Christian Feminism Today. In today's discussion, we'll center around one of his books titled The Gospel of Q, Jesus' Prophetic Wisdom. Here it is. And I'll have the links to purchase this book below in the description of this video. Welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Thank you, Jacob. It's great to be here. I appreciate your having me on.
Of course. So, could you tell us, how do you look at the Gospel of Q? I know that there are numerous different opinions about this document in scholarship, and also it faces criticism by a number of scholars that don't believe it actually existed.
Yes, thanks. That's a great question. So I start off by pointing out that I think you've already interviewed, kind of the starting lineup of scholars, top scholars in the field, who have, paved a lot of the way forward for the conversations and arguments for and against the Q hypothesis and variations thereon. And to put my work in a bit of context, as you've mentioned, this work on the Gospel of Q is part of a larger project that I've worked on with the extra-canonical Gospels starting back in 2013. So as part of that collection, I've translated and written on and published texts on the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Q, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Truth, and the infancy Gospels, the infancy Gospel of Thomas, and the infancy Gospel of James. And most recently, one that I'm publishing right now, it's not quite live yet, a book on the my translation of the Apocryphon of James, or the Secret Book of James. And generally in this series, one of the things that I'm trying to do, this is evidenced not only by the price range of the books that I sell on Amazon, but the size of them as well. I'm trying really not so much to make innovative new arguments, so much as to look at much of the academic consensus and communicate and bring some of that more academic conversation to a broader general public. So usually I don't write for scholars. Occasionally I will. I've occasionally written an article or a book review for an academic audience or setting, but usually I'm writing for the more general public, people who tend to be well read, because those are the folks who have heard of some of these texts and want to read up on them. So they're typically pretty well read folks, but a broader audience, and not necessarily just of Christians, but of anyone from any background who's interested in these texts. And I'm also trying to bridge the gap between the, if you will, the ivory tower and the pew, or the academy and the public, in terms of bringing out practical applications and, even hopefully some pastoral impacts and spiritual observations as well. And that's where my work on Q comes in. I began this work when I became interested in Christian mysticism and reading up on works of scholars like Cynthia Bourgeault, and an interest in digging into a lot of these sources and trying to build out more of an academic context for it. So hopefully, even though I'm not writing for scholars, nevertheless, my work is sufficiently well documented for scholars to follow along and see that I'm trying to do my homework and seeing where that evidence leads. So with respect to Q, excuse me, as others of your interviewees have talked about in some of the other interviews you've done with John Kloppenborg and others, there are multiple solutions to the synoptic problem. That is to say, ways to explain the literary interdependence, this obvious and easily demonstrable between the first three Gospels, the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Obviously, there's copying, going on between the three of them, although it's not always absolutely clear, where what direction that's taking. But for the most part, there is a consensus among academic scholars about the Q hypothesis, although there is a growing number of scholars who are questioning that and going back to some older theories like the Farrar hypothesis, for example. That's probably one of the more popular ones, or the Farrar-Goulder hypothesis, in which Matthew copied both Mark and Matthew, which would explain that passage of the double tradition, the agreement between Matthew and Luke, not otherwise attested in Mark. Simply that Luke, when Luke was not following Mark, simply selected to use Matthew instead. But there are a number of reasons why the independence of Matthew and Luke seems plausible, especially when one considers, if Luke was using Matthew, why did he not use certain Matthean, redactions, and why did he not use some of the Matthean material that we would have expected him to use, for example? So to me, the Q hypothesis makes sense. I think for me, it's the most plausible scenario, although again, it is a hypothetical reconstruction, essentially of those 200 or so verses between Matthew and Luke, again, that are not otherwise attested in Mark. So given Markan priority, which I believe scholars are generally agreed upon, if Mark was written first and Matthew and Luke were written independently, and each of them copied large portions of the Gospel of Mark, then how does one account for those 200 verses of overlap? In my own work, I haven't so much provided any innovative arguments for the particular reconstruction of Q, or which texts to include and how to redact them, or that sort of thing. Essentially, again, in my interest in following the consensus, I've used the work of the International Q Project and the Hermeneia commentary that Kloppenborg and others put together, which is a meticulous reconstruction based on comparing Matthew and Luke. So I essentially used their reconstruction, but provided my own translation from the Greek. So there are some unique aspects to my own translation and some of my conclusions, but essentially I've used the consensus, broad opinion about the shape and content of Q in my own work. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. How many of these sayings of Jesus in the Q document do you think was said by the actual man himself?
That is a great question. And I haven't tried to figure that out, to be honest. It's clear to me that there is genuine material in Q that appears to be, the actual words that Jesus, may have spoken, or a paraphrase, thereof. But how much of that would be authentic, historical Jesus material, I think it is difficult to know. There are clearly some portions of it that don't seem to go back as far as the 30s or the 20s. For instance, like the story of the centurion, doesn't appear to be an authentic reflection of a historical event. I think as others have written, there weren't Roman centurions hanging around Galilee in the 30s. So a story like that seems to be more at home in a period decades later, for example. But nevertheless, there are significant portions of Q that could arguably be historic, especially in the portions that are that some other scholars have described as the level of Q1, or material from like the Sermon on the Mount, or in Luke's version, it would be the Sermon on the Plain. But some of those sayings certainly strike one as being authentic to a large extent.
When do you think this document was written?
The majority opinion of those who argue for the Q hypothesis, I believe, would put it sometime between 50 and 70. I'd put it more closer to the 60s in Galilee. The only places that are mentioned in the text essentially are Galilean towns. So a Galilean, a rural Galilean setting for Q, getting closer to the war with the Roman War, I think, is plausible.
Do you date this text before the Gospel of Mark?
Yes, I think it's clear that Mark's gospel um, was not written before 70 CE, and in fact, I I'm beginning to see the wisdom or that becoming persuaded of the argument that Mark was familiar with the earlier work of Josephus, and certainly Luke, obviously among the gospel writers, is demonstrably reliant upon Josephus, especially in the Book of Acts. But the argument that Mark was familiar with Josephus seems plausible as well. So if Q was 60s, and Mark was later than that, I could certainly see that. Again, this is all entirely hypothetical. We're talking about possibilities and probabilities, but not certainties.
What about Matthew? Do you think Matthew knew Josephus since you think Mark and Luke did?
Uh, Mark and Luke, I believe so. Matthew, that would seem plausible. Um, you know, although his narrative about John the Baptist is, again drawn from Mark, but it does seem plausible to me that the gospel writers, were familiar with the works of Josephus.
There are some that think that the sayings of the sayings of Jesus in the Q document is somewhat reminiscent of Dead Sea Scroll teachings. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's certainly plausible. In fact, there are a lot of there's a large body of overlap between a lot of early Christian literature and Qumran documents, and sometimes I think there are a number of insights to be gleaned from that and from the Qumran materials. Uh, uh, in certainly in when we look at the shape and content of Q, starting with the ministry of John the Baptist and then moving into the ministry of Jesus, you know, scholars have often pointed out many similarities between John's ministry and practices that we find in the community at Qumran, including obviously baptism and things like that. So there was clearly a lot of activity in Judea among these various baptismal sects, and it's there seems to be a pretty broad consensus among the early writers that Jesus's ministry uh, uh, originated within that context, especially in the connections between Jesus and John the Baptist. So when we look at the outline of Q, and I do think it's possible to see a general outline when we look at the text, um, so that it's not simply a list of Jesus sayings that have no particular order to them. I think there does seem to be an order if we follow, as most scholars do, the order in which Luke presents the material as opposed to Matthew. We do see it, starting again with the ministry of John the Baptist, and then kind of based on the reconstruction of the International Q project, of course, a kind of a fragmented, what looks like a description of the baptism of Jesus, where Jesus is anointed as the Son of God when the Spirit rests upon him at his baptism, and then moving on into the some of Jesus's earliest core teaching, some of the material that we find in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, or the Sermon on the Plain, followed by of course, the pericope about the Roman centurion falls in that section thereafter, followed by the transition from the ministry from John into that of Jesus. There certainly seems to be a lot of a broad description of the meaning of Jesus's teachings within the context of those Judean baptismal groups.
So we have a super chat question.
All right.
Benjamin Love, thank you for your super chat. Other than cross-gospel similarity, which may be true, but no physical evidence of Aquila, other non-canonical gospels have a physical paper trail.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation, and again, it simply highlighting the fact that the Q hypothesis is is still a hypothesis. Again, I think it's still a plausible hypothesis, but it's true we don't have physical copies of this text. The question also brings to mind another really interesting and potentially significant observation that I think is worth making, especially when one thinks about the various treatments or works on Q that emphasize trying to reconstruct the community behind Q and develop ideas about the specific doctrinal teachings, or lack thereof in Q, is the fact that apart from the overlap between Matthew and Luke, we don't know how much other material may have been there. There could have been a lot of material that we don't know about because we don't have the actual document, just evidence, indirect evidence of its existence. So, for instance, when scholars go so far as to make very positive or very what's what I'm looking for, very certain statements about what the quote unquote Q community may have believed or not believed, it's not uncommon for a scholar to say, well, this community didn't believe in the crucifixion or resurrection of Jesus. This was a community of itinerant people who followed the historical Jesus, but they don't appear to have believed in those types of more traditional Christian doctrines, which I think is potentially trying to argue too much from an argument of silence. For one thing, for instance, the Q text does the reconstructed hypothetical Q text does presuppose an understanding about Jesus's crucifixion. In I think it is 1427, where Jesus talks about people taking up their crosses and their own crosses and following him. And we know at least two of the earlier readers and editors, people who use the Gospel of Q, did believe in the resurrection of Jesus. And those two, of course, are Matthew and Luke. So I don't think it's possible to draw too many conclusions, too many hard, and confident conclusions about the interpretation of Q or the communities that used Q, for instance, since it is a hypothetical reconstruction. And I would say the same is true of, attempts to delineate discrete layers of editorial work. And again, Kloppenborg has talked about three different strata of Q, or three different editorial layers. And I think that since Q is hypothetical as it is, it seems to me that getting into questions of how it itself may have been, edited through various layers is, in my mind, I just have a harder time with that. The idea of reconstructing the document itself is plausible to me, but by the time we get to trying to ferret out various strata or different layers of tradition within the document, and trying to look at the a form critical or a development of a community through the different layers, that does seem to be harder to pass the test of Occam's razor, because we're building more and more hypotheses and suggestions on top of one another, So, I mean, Q itself is essentially based on two hypotheses. One, the priority of Mark, and two, the independence of Matthew and Luke. But getting far beyond that, I think, might be possibly arguing more than what I'm comfortable arguing anyway.
Which diagram do you follow to solve the synoptic problem?
Well, I can envision in my mind's eye the types of diagrams you're talking about, and one of the types of diagrams that I always appreciate is one that's used to describe the four document hypothesis that shows the lines where you might have like Mark and Q up at the top, and then Matthew and Luke at the bottom, and then lines from Mark and Q, each running independently to Matthew and Luke, and then also the special L and special M, that is to say, material that is you find in the Gospel of Luke that you won't find in anywhere else, including Matthew, Mark, or Q, and vice versa, material in Matthew that you won't find in Mark or Q or Luke. So special Luke and special Matthew. Material that we don't have a lot of background for. It could be other documents, other traditions, other sources. Could be work from the evangelists themselves. I do find the prologue to Luke's gospel to be particularly interesting, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, where the author of Luke explicitly lays out the program of the work, talking about using other sources prior to that gospel. Excellent Theophilus, many have set out an ordered account of Jesus, and this is the best one there is. So the idea there is that the author is looking at other texts and other sources, and talking to other people, and concluding that the best gospel hasn't been written yet. So here, this gospel really can really be relied upon as presenting the best account of the words and works of Jesus. But the four document hypothesis is plausible to me. Let me just put it that way.
I'm going to show a couple of diagrams just a second on the screen.
Okay.
We do have a couple of other super chat questions I'm going to get to in just a second.
Perfect.
I'm just uploading this slide real fast. Just take a couple of seconds. Okay,
Cool.
Let's take a look at this next super chat in the meantime. Graham Pong, thank you for your super chat. Where the Gospels are written and then rewritten later, decades later, for a changing society, thereby messing up any sort of chance of easy dating of them?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think it's demonstrable that that there are certainly evolutions within the texts, some of which are demonstrably a matter of scribal harmonization. I think that can be demonstrated in some cases where scribes who are familiar with other gospel texts might perhaps inadvertently, perhaps intentionally, bring over something from those into their text. The longer ending of Mark 16, for instance, is clearly kind of an amalgamation of materials from the other gospels, just kind of compressed into a little ending there. But to a certain extent, there's much of that development that is not recoverable. And in fact, when we're talking about the Q hypothesis and the arguments for and against it, one of the bigger arguments against the Q hypothesis is bringing up the question of the minor agreements. That is, those agreements between Matthew and Luke over against Mark. How does one account for that? And then for our hypothesis, it's somewhat easy. It just means that Luke was using Mark, and now he's using Matthew over against Mark. But under the end, with the granted the Q hypothesis, how else might one explain that? And the explanations usually range somewhere between scribal interference and cross-cultural, cross-textual contamination. I almost prefer the word pollinization. It's a little more positive, because who's to say that one text influencing the development of another is not a positive development. But anyway, as neither here nor there. Other arguments posit, for instance, an earlier or a later version of the Gospel of Matthew that's being used by Matthew and Luke, or earlier or later versions of some of the other Gospels. Questions about secret Mark and its relationship to canonical Mark. Get to this question about the rewriting of Gospels. And I know there's that big question about the authenticity of secret Mark, so I'll just set that aside without getting too far down that bunny trail. But there is evidence that these Gospels were being written and rewritten, and clearly the way the Gospels use one another shows the changing circumstances and needs of different communities. For instance, just looking at the differences between Mark and the later Gospels. One of the things that I've argued in my book, Jesus' Prophetic Wisdom, is that drawing limited conclusions from the Q hypothesis, when we compare Q and Mark, we do see very different types of literature. Mark is largely a narrative gospel with a subversive bent to it. Whereas Q is heavy on teaching materials, it's didactic, and it has a more positive view of Jesus' disciples than Mark does. In Mark's Gospels, Jesus' disciples never do anything right, and everybody is always doing the opposite of what he tells them. The Q document is certainly more positive toward his disciples. So then when one looks at Matthew and Luke and their respective uses of Mark and Q, it certainly looks as if they've taken essentially the narrative structure of Mark and combined it with the didactic materials and the content of Q in order to create something that is different from both of them, and that lacks the the negative valence of Mark's gospel, and lays the foundation for more of a community church context, in the interests of building up and fleshing out and buttressing a kind of a context for the development of the institution of the church. So I do think that that those differing developments are discernible in the redaction history, or the redaction practices among these Gospels. Clearly, we can see some of the, especially when we read the Gospels in isolation on their own, we can see the different circumstances and interests and intents between the various gospel writers, which is a fantastic exercise, and I think helps bring a lot of insight between these different communities, if that makes sense.
Let's take a look at this next super chat, and then we'll get to the diagrams.
Okay.
Shows some cricket. Thank you for your super chat. Why wouldn't Q have been preserved by early Christians?
Well, I'm not sure what we mean when we say preserved by early Christians, because there were a lot of documents that were preserved for some time. For instance, when we look at the Gospel of Mary, we have a couple of Greek fragments from the 3rd century and an Egyptian text, about half of the text from the 5th century, and that's pretty good attestation when we look at even comparing it to attestation for the Gospel of Mark, for instance. But clearly, this document, like the Gospel of Mary, was or the Gospel of Thomas, these documents were copied and recopied, initially, for hundreds of years. After the 5th century, texts like the Gospel of Mary disappear from view, and we're not aware of any other texts. So certainly among the early communities, Q may have been preserved for generations, but then ultimately, not not otherwise, preserved long term, especially as the canon was being developed, and given its inclusion in Matthew and Luke, perhaps there were communities who felt that this document was no longer necessary to preserve independently. Um, and if you do look at the reconstructions of some other scholars who talk about this itinerant community in Galilee based on oral tradition, maybe they wouldn't have been inclined to preserve it. It's hard to say. I don't have a definitive answer to that question, but those are some thoughts that come to mind.
All right, let's take a look at the diagrams.
Okay.
This is the four document hypothesis.
Okay, that's not a diagram that I've seen before. I like it overall. That's a little more involved than what I was thinking,
Mhm.
but it's certainly plausible.
There are some that criticize this by saying there's too many hypothetical sources. But what do you think about the Proto-Luke, the document of infancy, the Antiochian document?
Again, I think it's plausible, and perhaps I misspoke when I talked about a four-document hypothesis. It probably would have been, perhaps would have been more accurate to talk about a two-document hypothesis. I think I've seen diagrams describing the four-document hypothesis that didn't get that detailed, um, but what we have depicted there is plausible. Again, though, when you're talking about Proto-Luke, the way one would talk about it, or Mark, or something like that, I think it's plausible, but um, you know, I, uh, I wouldn't argue that it's necessarily probable. Let me put it that way. Does that make sense? Yes, yes, yes. That one is, I think, a diagram that I particularly like, where you have Mark in purple, Q in blue, and then the green and the teal would be special Matthew and special Luke. I guess the material that was unique to Matthew and the material unique to Luke, would be the documents besides Mark and Q. What all those documents would have been, I'm not. I'm not precisely prepared to say. I know that some scholars, for instance, have argued that perhaps the Gospel of Peter is developed on a passion narrative that predated the other Gospels, which is possible. But again, it's very very hypothetical. But this particular diagram here, I think, is uh, this is the way that I tend to think of it.
What do you think about the position of the three document hypothesis? That Mark was also familiar with the Q document.
Um, I guess it could be one way to explain the minor agreements, but I'm not inclined uh, toward that position. But I could see possibly a person heading that direction, to address the minor agreements, so that where Matthew and Luke agree over against Mark, if Mark was also familiar with Q, and again, Q and Mark were at odds on some of those details. I suppose that would make sense. Now, when I say that, I'm speaking off the top of my head, because I have not been, uh, as uh, as involved in original research on Q, and I haven't spent much time with this since 2016. But off the top of my head, it would seem to me that could be a reason for positing it. Otherwise, I'm not familiar enough with the material with the academic conversation to be able to speak to it. I'm not particularly inclined toward the diagram that you have there, but I might be able to see how hypothetically that could be argued, perhaps. I don't know how much help that is. Another way to put it, I think, is that I think you've already, I think I mentioned at the beginning of the program that you've interviewed, the starting lineup of scholars who are at the forefront of Q research, and by the time you get to me, you're talking to the bench setters who are, have pretty broad interests. But so, okay, you've got another document here, or another diagram. Let's see. So you've got,
Yes, you mentioned Scrabble interference. So in this diagram, this
Mhm.
is a theory that suggests all the gospels use each other at the same time. All of them. They're all copying each other simultaneously. The
Fascinating.
Scrabble interference.
Fascinating. So this diagram here, now again, you probably know more. You probably know more about this than I do, but my guess is that this would imply most likely the development of several stages among each of the three gospels. So, for instance, there could have been an earlier version of Mark that Matthew and Luke used, but then a later version of Mark would have been borrowing from Matthew, for example. And so you would have a ton of scribal interference in the composition of the various layers, editorial layers of each of the Gospels. Is that what you're describing?
I think so. But basically, what's happening here is I think what this diagram is trying to do is trying to explain why none like basically some people like the synoptic. Some people will say the synoptic problem cannot be solved, and they think it
Mm-hmm.
can only be solved if they were if all the gospel authors were simultaneously familiar with each other's work, composed at the same time.
There's a very interesting uh, image in the beginning of the Apocryphon of James, where the 12 disciples are all sitting around together, all in the same place, writing their gospels, writing their accounts of what Jesus said and did. And it's a in a way it's kind of humorous, but it's a very interesting image where you can imagine, the gospel writers looking over one another's shoulders, and one could see Matthew looking over Mark's shoulder and copying part of it down. So it's a very interesting image, although obviously it's not at all a historical image, by any stretch. But it's a funny image that occurred to me when you've put this diagram on the screen. But again, I can't really speak to it. I don't know how one would be able to um, outline exactly how this would have worked, or what different versions of the Gospels would have been, composed at different stages. That would seem to me to be like a ball of yarn you wouldn't be able to unwrap. But so again, I'm just, I can draw some conclusions, based on the diagram as to what someone was thinking when they argued the point. But I'm not particularly well read about that argument, or right. I haven't researched that argument, and I can't directly speak to it, if that makes sense.
Do you think that Paul may have known about the Q document?
Off the top of my head, I can't think of any particular reason that Paul would have been familiar with Q. In fact, Paul, for the most part, seems uninterested in the historical Jesus. Paul mentions brief, brief factoids about the birth of Jesus, the death of Jesus, and so forth. And will quote Jesus very, very rarely, but for the most part, Paul doesn't seem to be that interested in the historical Jesus. He is certainly much more focused on the doctrine of Christ, Christ Jesus, about the about his crucifixion, his resurrection, and how to organize the various communities, across the Mediterranean world, made up of people, largely Gentiles, who are following, this Jewish messianic figure. Um, but I can't think off the top of my head of any particular arguments why Paul should have known Q or have been interested in Q.
Final question for today. Why do you think the Q gospel was written down? What do you think the point was?
Oh, yes, that's a great question. That's a fabulous question. I think, again, when we're turning our attention to what it is that particular uh, 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 this particular outline and sequence of teachings, gets at, um, I think we're also, looking at some of the same questions we look at when scholars consider, research about the historical Jesus. And scholars, debate about whether Jesus was a cynic sage, whether he was an apocalyptic prophet of doom, whether he was, what kind of person this Jesus was, and what he thought of himself. Did he believe that he was the Messiah? Did he believe that he was the Son of God? Did he believe that he was God? What is it precisely that Jesus believed about himself? Does it matter what he believed about himself, or does it matter what we believe about him? I mean, those questions get pretty thorny. But when we look at the picture of Jesus that emerges from Q, I mentioned earlier in the outline that we begin with the ministry of John the Baptist, and then have a fragmented account of Jesus's anointment as the Son of God at his baptism, and then moving into his ministry. From there, Q does present Jesus as the Son of God, apparently understood along the lines of the Davidic Messiah, like looking back at like going back to Psalm 2:7, for instance. Um, and and Jesus is clearly presented as a prophet in the text, and some scholars have considered playing off the idea of Jesus as sage against Jesus as prophet, you know, uh, but in his work on the historical Jesus, N.T. Wright actually made an interesting point when he said that you can't necessarily play these different conceptions off against one another. Um, yeah, and Wright identifies the category of Jesus as sage under the category of Jesus as prophet. But an interesting thing happens in Wright's reconstruction there, because once he has subsumed Jesus the sage under Jesus the prophet, then Jesus as sage kind of drops off out of view, and then the focus all goes to Jesus as a prophet. But I'm wondering if perhaps it might not be the other way around, that Jesus's prophetic testimony against injustice, might not have been something that grew out of his role as a wisdom teacher. And I think all of that seems to come together in several portions of the text. For instance, in the early description of the parable of the house built on the sand. Um, there's certainly a warning of judgment if the way of wisdom is not followed. Um, so Jesus as essentially a wisdom prophet, a prophet against social injustice, whose observations and concerns and cares grows out of the two ways tradition, of the broader wisdom movement that one finds, again, more broadly and perennially among a number of other religious communities. Um, and certainly as a prophet of wisdom, in Q, we have Jesus describing wisdom as sending out her prophets, and as wisdom being vindicated by her children. And if you look in the context of that saying, who are the children of wisdom? Two of the children who are most close to mind there are John the Baptist and Jesus. So Jesus as a child of wisdom, or a son of wisdom, a prophet of wisdom, as a son, I think is a very plausible reading of the document. And this reading of Jesus a as a wisdom prophet, certainly seems consistent with, I think, a very plausible reconstruction, of Jesus as a prophet, in first century Judea. So, preserving that understanding of Jesus and the teachings that undergird, or uh, preserve that perennial tradition that that wisdom tradition, I think, is a plausible, reason for the creation of the Q source.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Mark.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure, and it's been a good learning experience for me too. So thank you for having me.
And I thank the free people once again for super chatting their questions. I appreciate their support. And I thank everybody else for participating in the live chat. And I will see all of you later. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.